My girlfriend and her daughter used me as an ATM for 10 years. I paid $40K for college and a car. But when I saw the wedding announcement, I found out I wasn't invited, while the absent father would walk her down the aisle. I canceled everything and left them speechless. I'm 48 years old, work in corporate finance, and what happened 6 months ago basically opened my eyes to how I'd been used for an entire decade. The truth is, I still have trouble processing it all. You know, because when you give so much of yourself and convince yourself you're doing the right thing, the last thing you expect is to be treated like you're invisible. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I met Michelle like 10 years ago, maybe a bit more. She had a daughter, Nicole, who was about 8 years old at the time, and from day one she made it clear they came as a package deal. It didn't bother me at all. I mean, I'd never had kids of my own, and I thought I'd be a father figure to someone who really needed it because, well, Nicole's biological father, Brian, was basically a ghost who showed up when it was convenient for him and disappeared for months or years without any explanation. Michelle was a waitress when I met her, worked night shifts at a chain restaurant, one of those places that stays open late. And honestly, she didn't make much. Nicole went to a public school that wasn't the greatest, and they lived in a small apartment where you could hear everything happening in the neighboring units. I already had an established career at that point, a house of my own that I'd bought years before, and I guess subconsciously, I felt good about the idea of being able to help them. You know what I mean? Like it made me feel useful and needed. Michelle stopped working maybe a year after we started dating, and it wasn't something I suggested exactly. But I didn't oppose it either when she said she wanted to spend more time with Nicole and that my income covered everything easily. And she was right. Honestly, I made good money, and supporting 3 people wasn't really a financial problem for me. Nicole called me James, never Dad, and I didn't push it because I understood she had a biological father out there somewhere. But the thing is, Brian didn't pay child support, didn't call regularly, and when he did show up, it was only to promise things he never delivered. I remember one Christmas when Nicole was like 10 years old. Brian promised he'd come spend the day with her and was going to bring her that Nintendo game she desperately wanted. Nicole waited all morning looking out the window, literally pressed against the glass, and Brian never showed up, didn't even call. It was Michelle who finally had to tell Nicole that her dad probably wasn't coming, and I was the one who ran out to Target to buy that damn Nintendo because I couldn't stand seeing that kid crying on Christmas Day. But when Brian finally showed up like a week later with some made-up excuse, Nicole forgave him immediately and hugged him like he was the best father in the world. I didn't say anything. Just stood there in my own house watching this guy who hadn't given a cent for his daughter receive all that unconditional love. And that's how it was for years. Basically, I paid for everything. The clothes, the food, the extracurricular activities, family vacations, medical expenses, when Nicole got sick, everything. Michelle used my credit card like it was hers, which technically didn't bother me because I considered us a family, but looking back, I should have seen the signs. There was never a real conversation about getting married, like Michelle always changed the subject when I mentioned it, and now I understand why. But at the time, I thought she just didn't care about formalities, and that what we had was solid anyway. Nicole grew up, went from being a little girl to a teenager, and during all that time, Brian kept being the ghost he'd always been, showing up maybe 3 or 4 times a year, never with money, never with meaningful gifts, but always received like he was some hero returning from war. When Nicole turned 18 and graduated high school, I'd already been saving for her college education. I'd opened an account specifically for that, because I knew Michelle had no way to pay for college and Brian wasn't going to contribute anything. Nicole applied to several universities and was accepted to a state school that was like 2 hours away, nothing too far but enough that she'd need to live on campus. Tuition, housing, books, all that added up to like $40,000 for 4 years, and I paid it all up front because I had the money and because, that's what you do for your family. I also bought her a car, a used 2018 Honda Civic, but in excellent condition because she needed something reliable to go back and forth. It wasn't anything extravagant, cost like $15,000, but it was perfectly functional and safe. Nicole left for college in August, and during that first year, Michelle and I had the house to ourselves for the first time in like 9 years. I thought maybe that would bring us closer, that we'd have time to reconnect as a couple. But the truth is, Michelle spent most of experience, her time talking on the phone with Nicole or watching TV. I worked, came home, we ate dinner together, usually without much conversation, and that was our routine. It wasn't bad exactly, but it also wasn't what I'd imagined. Nicole came home during holidays and long weekends, and during those visits, I noticed there was something different in how she treated me, like more distant. But I attributed it to her growing up and becoming more independent, which is normal, I guess. Everything exploded, or rather started falling apart, when Nicole was in her senior year of college. She came home one weekend in February and announced during dinner that her boyfriend had proposed. She'd gotten engaged to a guy she'd met in college, someone I'd seen maybe 3 or 4 times total during the years they'd been together. Michelle was super excited, crying and hugging Nicole, and I was happy too because, well, that's what you're supposed to do when someone in your family gets engaged. Nicole said they wanted to get married in August, right after her graduation, and that they were thinking of a big wedding because the groom's family was large and they had lots of friends. I automatically assumed I was going to pay for the wedding, just like I'd paid for everything else. And when I mentioned it, Nicole said, "Thanks, James. That would be amazing." And Michelle kissed my cheek like I'd just done something extraordinary, when really, it was exactly what was expected of me. The next few months were chaos of wedding planning. Michelle and Nicole spent hours looking at bridal magazines, visiting reception venues, tasting cakes, choosing flowers, all that shit. I basically signed the checks and gave my opinion when they asked for it, which wasn't very often. Nicole graduated in May without having gotten a job yet, which didn't worry me too much because I understood the job market was tough. And she and her fiancé moved back to my house temporarily while they looked for work and finished planning the wedding. So suddenly I had 4 people living in my house, including the future son-in-law, and I was still paying for everything because none of them had income. The wedding was scheduled for August 3rd, and around mid-June, I told Nicole I needed the guest list so I could send invitations to my people. I had friends from work, some cousins, people who'd been part of my life for years, and I wanted them there to celebrate. I told her I needed to invite about 20 people, which seemed reasonable to me considering the wedding was going to have like 250 guests total. Nicole looked at me weird and said she was going to review the numbers with her mom and the groom's family, and I thought, well, maybe they need to adjust some details. No problem. A week passed, 2 weeks, and every time I asked, Nicole told me they were still working on the list. It was my friend Eric who finally opened my eyes to what was happening. Eric had been my friend since college. We'd kept in touch for years, and I'd obviously mentioned him as one of the guests I wanted to bring to the wedding. One day in late June, Eric called me and said, "Hey, I got the wedding announcement for Nicole. Looks like it's going to be amazing." And I was like, "Announcement? What announcement?" And Eric said, "Yeah, that fancy paper with all the wedding information came in the mail yesterday." I hadn't seen any announcement, and when I asked him, he said it was basically a formal notification that Nicole was getting married, with the parents' names and all the information, but it didn't say anything about him being specifically invited. It was just an announcement. That night I checked the mail more carefully, and sure enough, there it was. An envelope addressed to me that had arrived days before, but that I'd ignored because I assumed it was advertising or something. I opened it, and it was exactly what Eric had described. An elegant announcement on thick paper saying that Nicole Elizabeth was entering into matrimony, and the names that appeared as parents were Brian and Michelle. My name wasn't anywhere. It was like I didn't exist. Like I hadn't spent 10 years raising this kid, paying for everything she'd ever needed, including the damn wedding they were planning. I sat there in my kitchen looking at that paper and feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. I went to find Michelle, who was in the living room watching some reality show, and I showed her the announcement. I asked her why my name wasn't there, why only she and Brian appeared, and she looked at me like I was overreacting. She said that technically, Brian was Nicole's biological father, and that it made sense for his name to appear on the announcement. I said to her, "And what am I? The ATM? I've paid for everything for 10 years. I'm paying for this wedding, and I don't even deserve to have my name appear." Michelle sighed. In that way you sigh when someone is bothering you with insignificant details, and said it wasn't that big a deal, that it was just a piece of paper. And then I asked her about my guest list, the 20 people I wanted to bring, and that's when she told me the truth. Turns out Nicole, and she had been reviewing the guest list and had decided to make cuts because the reception venue had a capacity limit. And when she said cuts, she specifically meant my 20 people. None of my friends, none of my cousins, nobody from my side was invited to the wedding I was paying for. I asked her how it was possible they'd cut all my people when the wedding was going to have 250 guests, and Michelle started giving excuses about the groom's family being very large, and Nicole's friends from college, and Brian's cousins who hadn't seen Nicole in years but who somehow deserved to be there more than the people who mattered to me. I felt something break inside me at that moment, something that had been cracking for years but finally shattered completely. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. Just told Michelle I needed to think about some things and went to my room. I spent that night basically sleepless, doing mental calculations of everything I'd spent on Nicole over a decade. The $40,000 for college, the $15,000 for the car, the clothes, the medical expenses, the vacations, and now the wedding that was going to cost like another $30,000. I'd invested practically everything in this family, in this kid who didn't even consider me important enough to invite my friends to her wedding. The next week, we had a scheduled dinner at the parents' house of Nicole's fiancé, the future in-laws. It was one of those formal dinners where both families get together to get to know each other better before the wedding, and I really didn't feel like going, but Michelle insisted. The groom's parents, especially the mother whose name was Barbara, were that kind of people who talk a lot and have opinions about everything, and during dinner she didn't stop talking about how excited she was about the wedding and how beautiful Nicole was going to look. I sat there pushing food around my plate and trying to seem interested, but honestly, I just wanted to leave. And then Nicole stood up, raised her glass, and announced she had something special to share. She said she'd been thinking a lot about the ceremony and had decided that her dad, Brian, was going to walk her down the aisle. "My dad is going to give me away," she said with that huge smile, and everyone at the table started applauding and saying how nice and how special. Brian, who was sitting there next to Michelle, looked all proud, like he'd actually done something to deserve that honor. I sat there feeling blood rushing to my face, and Michelle put her hand on my arm like saying, "Please don't make a scene." But you know what? I'd had enough. I stood up, raised my glass, and said I also had an announcement to make. Everyone looked at me, expecting I was going to say something, too emotional about Nicole or about the family. And I said, very calmly, that after thinking about it a lot, I'd decided to withdraw my financial support for the wedding. I said that clearly my presence and participation weren't valued, that my friends weren't welcome, and that Brian, being the involved father he was, could surely take care of paying for everything. The silence at that table was incredible. Like you could hear a pin drop, and Barbara looked at me like I'd just killed her dog. Nicole started crying. Michelle looked horrified, and Brian just sat there with his mouth open. I left my glass, grabbed my keys, and left that house. The next thing I did, and it was probably the most satisfying part of this whole situation, was cancel absolutely everything I'd booked for the wedding. I called the reception venue Monday morning, explained I needed to cancel the reservation, and since there were still like 5 weeks until the date, I lost the $5,000 deposit but avoided paying the other $25,000 I would have owed. I canceled the catering service, canceled the photographer, canceled the florist, everything. Some of the vendors refunded part of the money, others kept the deposits, but in total I saved myself like $20,000 that I would have spent on that wedding. I also went to the bank and closed the joint account I had with Michelle, transferred all the money to my personal account, and changed the passwords on all my accounts so she couldn't access them. Michelle and Nicole came back to the house that afternoon, and when I got home from work, they were crying in the living room. Nicole yelled at me, how could I do this to them? That I'd ruined her wedding, that I was a monster. Michelle begged me to reconsider, to think about Nicole, that this was going to traumatize her forever. And I just told them they had a week to pack their things and find another place to live. Nicole screamed that it wasn't fair, that she had no money or job. And I told her maybe her dad, Brian, the man who was going to walk her down the aisle, could help her. Michelle said they couldn't move that fast, that they needed more time, and I gave them 2 weeks instead of 1, but made it clear that after that, I was going to change the locks, and anything left in the house was going to the trash. The next 2 weeks were hell, honestly. Michelle and Nicole packed while shooting me hate-filled looks. Nicole's fiancé came to help them and avoided me like I had a contagious disease, and I basically locked myself in my room when I wasn't working. Eric called me a couple of times to see how I was, and when I told him everything that had happened, he said I'd done the right thing, that those people had been using me for years, and it was time I thought about myself. Donna, who was a gossipy friend of Michelle's, called to tell me I was selfish and that I was destroying the life of an innocent young woman, and I hung up on her mid-conversation. Michelle and Nicole finally moved out like 3 days before the deadline. They didn't tell me where they were going exactly, just packed everything in a moving truck that I assume was paid for by the groom's family or maybe Brian. Though I doubt that knowing that guy. The day they left, they didn't even say goodbye, just left the keys on the kitchen table and left without a word. I changed the locks that same day, hired someone to come and do it immediately, because I didn't trust that Michelle hadn't made copies of the keys to come back later. Like a week after they left, Brian called me. The nerve of this guy had no limits. He called my cell phone. I don't even know how he got my number because I'd never given it to him directly, and asked if we could talk about the wedding. He said he understood things had gotten tense, but at the end of the day, everyone wanted what was best for Nicole, and maybe we could reach an agreement about the financing issue. I asked him if he going to put in money, and he went quiet for a moment before saying his financial situation wasn't the best right now, but he was working on it. I told him that sounded like a problem between him and Nicole, and hung up on him. He blocked me after that, or I blocked him. I don't remember exactly. But the point is, we didn't talk again. Nicole also called me, like 2 weeks after moving out. She told me that because of me, everything was harder now, that they'd had to find a cheaper place for the reception, that they'd reduced the guest list to less than 100 people, that basically I'd ruined her special day. I told her if she wanted a special day, maybe she should have treated me with a little respect. And she started crying, saying I didn't understand the pressure she was under, that planning a wedding was very stressful. I told her having a wedding was optional, that nobody was forcing her to get married at 22 with no job, and she yelled some things at me that I prefer not to repeat before hanging up. Like a month later, I received a letter from Michelle. It was one of those long handwritten letters where she basically explained what a horrible person I was and how I'd destroyed Nicole's self-esteem. She said Nicole was in a terrible depressive state, that she'd lost weight, that she cried every day, and that it was all my fault because I'd been cruel and insensitive. She also mentioned that Nicole and her fiancé had postponed the wedding indefinitely because they couldn't afford it, and that Michelle hoped I was proud of myself for having ruined a young woman's dreams. I read the letter once and threw it in the trash. I didn't respond, didn't call, didn't do anything. Eric was the one who told me, like 2 months after all the drama, that Nicole's wedding had been officially canceled. Not postponed, canceled. Apparently Nicole and her fiancé had broken up, though Eric didn't know the exact details because he'd only heard rumors through people who knew. The ex-fiancé's family. My theory is the fiancé probably realized what a circus that family was and decided to run while he could. But who knows? Michelle sent me a text message like a week after. I found out through Eric, telling me she and Nicole were moving out of state to live with Michelle's aunt in Arizona or Nevada. I don't remember exactly. She said they needed a fresh start away from all the painful memories, and I thought, yeah, sure. I'm the painful memory and not the fact that Brian was never there for his daughter, except when it was convenient for him. Now it's been 6 months since everything exploded. My house is quiet. My finances are in order for the first time in a decade because I'm not supporting 3 additional people. And honestly, I feel lighter than ever. Some of my friends from work have told me I was too harsh, that I should have been the adult in the situation and not reacted so drastically. But most people who know the whole story understand why I did what I did. Barbara, the ex-fiancé's mother, called me once like 2 weeks after the dinner to tell me it was my responsibility to fix the situation because I was Nicole's father, and I told her no. Technically, Brian was Nicole's father, and maybe she should call him instead. I never heard from her again. The truth is, I don't regret anything. Maybe it sounds harsh or vindictive, and it probably is a little, but when someone uses you for 10 years and then treats you like you're invisible at the moment when your presence should matter most, there comes a point where you have to say, enough is enough. Nicole never called me dad, never treated me like a father figure except when she needed money, And Michelle never saw me as a real partner but as a convenient provider. And the worst part is, I let it happen, year after year, convincing myself I was building a family when really, I was just being used. Sometimes, I wonder how they're doing in Arizona or Nevada or wherever they ended up. I wonder if Nicole finally got a job, if Michelle found another guy to support her, if Brian is still the absent father he always was but somehow still gets worshipped. But those questions only come to mind occasionally, like when I'm lying in bed before falling asleep, and honestly, they don't keep me up at night. I'm dating someone new now, a woman my age who has her own career and her own income. No kids, no drama from ex-partners, and it's refreshing to have a relationship that feels equitable for the first time in years. Last week I found an old photo of Nicole when she was like 9 years old, one I took on a beach vacation we did. She was smiling with an ice cream in her hand, all happy and carefree, and for a second I felt something like nostalgia or maybe sadness for what could have been. But then I remembered the wedding announcement with my name missing. Remembered Nicole saying Brian was going to walk her down the aisle. Remembered 10 years of being treated like an ATM instead of a real family member. I threw the photo in the trash along with the rest of the things I'd been keeping from that time in my life. I don't need reminders of a time when I valued myself so little that I allowed others to use me without limit. And I guess that's all I have to say about the subject.